Click the footnote. That's all it takes to start unraveling the single most repeated fact about how the offshore dollar market was born. $800,000 moved on one exact date that almost nobody has actually checked. February the 28th, 1957. $800,000. If you've ever read anything about the origin of offshore dollars, the strange, half-invisible market that today moves money for governments, banks, and corporations far outside the United States, you've probably run into that number and that date. It shows up in encyclopedias, in finance blogs, in documentaries. It's told like a fact you could look up in a bank's ledger. So we looked, and where that number actually leads is not where you'd expect. Here's how the story is usually told. Sometime in the mid-1950s, communist governments holding American dollars got nervous about keeping them inside the reach of the United States government. So the story goes, the term Eurodollar itself comes from a Paris bank owned by the Soviet Union, the Banque Commerciale pour l'Europe du Nord, whose telex cable address happened to be Euro Bank. Type that address into a machine in Paris, and money moved. That's the version most retellings agree on, though even that origin has been repeated for decades without anyone tracing it back to an original document. What historians don't agree on is who moved the first dollars and why. One version says it was Communist China, as early as 1949, shifting dollar holdings to that same Paris bank before the United States could freeze what was left of them during the Korean War. A different, more famous version says it was the Soviet Union. In early 1957, after the Hungarian uprising was crushed, sometimes after Suez is added to the story too, wiring exactly $800,000 into the London branch of a Soviet-owned bank, the Moscow Narodny Bank, to get it out of reach. Two governments, 2 different years, 2 different triggering events. Both versions can't be the founding moment, and yet you'll find each one presented confidently as simply what happened. That's usually where a documentary about this topic just picks the more dramatic version and moves on. We're not going to do that, because when you actually pull on the thread of that oddly specific number, $800,000, February the 28th, it doesn't lead where the story implies it leads. So, we did what almost nobody bothers to do. We opened the page, found the number, and clicked the footnote. It leads to a Wikipedia entry on the Moscow Narodny Bank, which states the transfer as fact, and cites at the bottom of the page a single source, George Goodman, writing under the pen name Adam Smith, in his 1981 popular finance book, Paper Money, page 122. Not a bank record, not a declassified cable, not a contemporary newspaper report from 1957. A paperback, written for a general audience, 24 years after the fact. That doesn't make the number false. It makes it unconfirmed. A fact that has been repeated so many times by so many sources citing each other that it has taken on the texture of something proven. We went looking for an independent record, a bank archive, a period financial press account, anything published closer to 1957 than to 1981, and we didn't find one. This is the trail we could follow, and it ends here. What we found instead is more interesting than the anecdote it replaces. In 1998, an economic historian named Catherine Schenck went into the actual bank archives, not the popular accounts, the records, for a peer-reviewed study of how the Eurodollar market began. Her conclusion complicates the legend rather than confirming it. Schenck found Eurodollar deposits already accumulating as early as mid-1955, driven by something far less cinematic than Cold War fear, British banking regulation, and a rate arbitrage trick pioneered by Midland Bank. letting depositors earn more on dollars held outside the United States than inside it. If she's right, the market didn't begin with a nervous Soviet phone call in 1957. It began 2 years earlier, in a much duller room, with bankers chasing a better interest rate. There's one more detail worth knowing before we move on, because it explains how the 1957 transfer, whatever its exact size and date really were, was even mechanically possible. The Moscow Narodny Bank wasn't a new shell built overnight for the occasion. Its London branch had operated as a UK-registered company since 1919, dating back to the Tsarist era. The Soviet Union already owned a legally British bank. It didn't need to invent a hiding place. It already had one. Here's what we can say with confidence, and it doesn't depend on which version of the 1957 legend you believe. The fear behind it was not paranoia. It had already happened once, on the record. In mid-December 1950, the United States Treasury invoked the Trading with the Enemy Act and froze every Chinese Communist and North Korean asset it could reach under American jurisdiction, a direct response to China entering the Korean War. It was fast, it was total, and it was public. Any government watching in Moscow or Beijing in the years that followed didn't need a rumor to know what Washington was capable of doing to a dollar account it didn't like. It had watched it happen already. Then, in 1956, Washington showed something even its closest ally couldn't shrug off. During the Suez crisis, the United States blocked Britain's request for an IMF loan and threatened to sell off the pound sterling bonds it held until London agreed to a ceasefire. Britain, not an adversary, an ally, ended up drawing $561 million from the IMF, at the time the largest single drawing any country had ever made. Some tellings of the Eurodollar origin story point to Suez as the trigger for the Soviet move. Others point to Hungary instead. The sources disagree, and we're not going to pretend they don't. What Suez does prove, independent of any of that, is that the dollar was already a lever Washington was willing to pull against friend and foe alike. And here's the detail that turns out to matter more than any anecdote from 1957. None of this money, wherever it was booked, ever fully left American plumbing. Then and now, virtually every dollar transaction on Earth, no matter where the account sits, eventually clears through New York, through the Federal Reserve's Fedwire system, or the private CHIPS network, or through a correspondent account at a US bank. Offshore dollars were never offshore in the sense of untouchable. They were offshore in the sense of unregulated. Those are two very different kinds of freedom, and the difference is about to decide everything. So let's put the two moments side by side, not the disputed 1957 legend, but the documented mechanics of it, against what just happened in 2022. In 1957, whatever the exact sum, Soviet-linked dollars moved into custody in London and Paris, jurisdictions that, when the moment came, did not join in freezing Soviet-controlled assets. The money sat outside the coalition that could seize it. It worked. In 2022, after Russia invaded Ukraine, Western governments moved to freeze somewhere between $280 and $330 billion of Russian central bank reserves. The estimates vary by source, so we're giving you the range, not a single number. The great majority of that money wasn't sitting in Moscow. It was sitting offshore, the same instinct that moved Soviet money in 1957, spread across custodians outside Russia for safety. Roughly $200 billion of it, 194 billion euros as of June 2025, sat at a single institution. Euroclear, a securities depository in Belgium, holding an amount equal to about 85% of its entire balance sheet. And this time, the custodian didn't sit outside the coalition. Belgium is inside it. Euroclear complied. Same defensive instinct. Same basic idea. Move the money somewhere the home government can't reach it. Opposite result. And once you line the two cases up like this, a pattern appears that no single source we found states outright. This is our own reading of the record, not a quote from any one historian or economist. Offshore was never really about being outside the United States. It was about being outside whichever coalition was doing the freezing. In 1957, that coalition didn't include London or Paris. In 2022, it included Brussels. The geography of safe isn't fixed. It moves with politics, and the one thing that hasn't moved at all in either era is that the actual dollar payment still clears through New York either way. The custody can hide, the clearing never has. If a story like this, the kind that starts with a single footnote and ends up rewriting how you see a headline you already thought you understood, is the kind of thing you want more of, that's what this channel does, once a week. Subscribing costs nothing and keeps the next one in front of you. Now, about that headline, you've probably already seen that the frozen Russian reserves are quietly killing the dollar's dominance. The data says something more complicated. If the 2022 freeze really shattered confidence in holding dollars, you'd expect central banks around the world to be visibly walking away from the currency in the numbers that followed. They aren't. At least, not in a way this freeze can take credit for. In the last quarter of 2022, the dollar's share of the world's allocated foreign exchange reserves stood at 58.4%. 1 year earlier, before the freeze, it was 58.5%, essentially unchanged. There is a real, slow decline in the dollar's reserve share. Economists have tracked it losing roughly half a percentage point a year since the euro launched in 1999. But that decline was already running on the same trend line before 2022, and it kept running on roughly that same trend line after. The freeze didn't accelerate it in any way the aggregate numbers can show, at least not yet, and not in the data available as this research was done. If you came here expecting a story about the dollar's coming collapse, the honest answer is the numbers don't support that story, not this one. So what actually connects a Cold War bank in London to a Belgian clearinghouse in 2022? Not $800,000 and not a single footnote. It's the same human engine running underneath both stories. Fear of confiscation moves money every time to wherever the money holder believes their government's enemies can't reach it. That fear was justified in 1950, real in 1956, and acted on, however the details actually happened, in 1957. It's still justified today. What's never stayed fixed is the map. In 1957, safe meant London and Paris. In 2022, Brussels turned out not to mean safe at all. The engine hasn't changed in 65 years. The border of where it's safe to hide keeps redrawing itself, one coalition at a time, and the next redraw is already being decided quietly by choices being made right now, in places most people will never think to click a footnote and check.